All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Noah Sobi, now Senior Project Officer at UNESCO, where I have the privilege of working on UNESCO's new flagship initiative on the futures of education, learning to become. In a moment, you'll hear more about the structure of the project and the work that we've accomplished to date from my colleague Sobi Tawil. This CIES 2020 panel, which is now, of course, a virtual CIES 2020 panel, came about because we wanted the chance for an exchange with as many people as possible in the field. I want to start by giving a warm thank you to Iveta and her team for organizing this keynote panel. And we're particularly honored to have with us today 4 members of UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education, Arjun Appadurai, Fernando Reimers, Karen Mundy, and Antonio Novoa, all of whom are well known in the comparative and international education community, which is why we asked them to join us today to share some of their thoughts on the futures of education. My colleague Annette Domater is also with us, and she's going to be monitoring the chat window and relaying questions later in the session. So we've posted, they've disappeared, but we'll repost links with information about the initiative, and you should all feel free to type your comments and questions in the chat box at any time. So a lot of people have expressed the idea that the COVID-19 crisis and the educational disruptions we're seeing around the globe lend a massive urgency to the need to rethink what humanity and our societies have become and what they might yet become. Iveta already headed us in this direction with the invitation to think about education beyond the human. And I'm happy to say UNESCO's work on rethinking and reimagining education is also well underway. So now let me turn the floor over to Sobi Tawil from UNESCO for a more complete introduction to the project.
Thank you, Noah, and welcome to all. Thank you also to our 4 panelists today and to all of those who are joining us for this panel. Thank you also to Iveta and CIES for organizing the panel in these challenging times. The global pandemic is affecting all regions and most countries of the world with the multidimensional impacts: social, economic, political, civic, and of course educational. We're really in uncharted territory, and we've recently heard from the World Health Organization that while there is a lot that we know, there's also a lot that we don't know. We don't know how COVID-19 will continue to spread. We don't know for how long measures of social distancing, restricting mobility, measures of confinement, school closures will last. What we're seeing is that initial temporary school closures are being extended and prolonged in a number of cases. We now have worldwide over 130 countries with countrywide school closures. An estimated 80% of all learners worldwide who are affected by these closures. And this is disrupting learning communities at all levels. We've heard this, we've been in dialogue with ministers from around the world here at UNESCO in the past 10 days, and most recently yesterday. The impact is both immediate and longer term. And it also has implications for how we understand education, how we understand learning, how we see the role of schools and universities, how we also reconstruct and redefine learning communities, the role of families, the role of teachers, and more broadly, the purpose of education and the way we see and perceive the future. And this is precisely the aim of the Futures of Education initiative, Futures of Education, Learning to Become. The aim of the initiative is really to reimagine how knowledge and learning can shape the future of humanity and the planet. The initiative is very much in line with UNESCO's tradition to rethink the purpose of education, to look at the bigger picture, and rethink the purpose of education and the organization of learning at key moments of key historical junctures of societal transformation. This was first done in the late 60s, early 70s, as many of you would know, with the publication Learning to Be, and that came out in 1972. It was followed in the mid 90s, and following the end of the Cold War, with Learning, the Treasure Within, and what most people know more commonly as the Delors Report. And more recently in 2015 with Rethinking Education Towards a Global Common Good. The initiative, the Futures of Education initiative, was launched last September in New York at the UN General Assembly by the Director General of UNESCO, together with the President of Ethiopia, who is chairing the International Commission, along with a number of other heads of state and ministers. The International Commission on the Futures of Education is composed of thought leaders representing a range of profiles from all regions. And the Commission is tasked with preparing a global report on the futures of education to be launched late next year, 2021, at the UNESCO General Conference. The report will propose a vision for education as we look to the future. And the aim of the report is to catalyze global debate, research, and action. But in developing the work now, and in the work of the Commission that is being supported by the Secretariat at UNESCO, we're also managing two parallel tracks to enrich and support the work of the Commission. The first track is reviewing research and collecting expert input from a range of partners and partner networks. And the second track is catalyzing a global debate through different dialogues, seminars, focus group discussions, and online platforms. And I believe our colleague Annette has posted or will be posting some of those links right now. The Commission met for the first time in late January and proposed the visioning and framing of the futures of education. The link should also be online to this short 4-page document. It defines the current context of complexity, uncertainty, and fragility, which has only been enhanced since the outbreak of the pandemic. The framing visioning document also calls for redefining or revisiting our understandings of development and human flourishing. It recognizes the plural realities that we need to navigate as we look to the future, and the differential weights of the past in ensuring the right to basic education. It also reaffirms a humanistic approach to development and to education and to knowledge as a global common good. And finally, it outlines 4 broad areas for exploration, and all 4 from the lens of equity and inclusion. And these 4 areas are human and planetary sustainability, knowledge production, access and governance, citizenship and participation, and finally work and economic security. So thank you again all for taking part in the conversation and in today's panel, which is part of this broader conversation. And today we're really privileged to have 4 members of the International Commission on the panel. And this conversation, as we said, is even more timely today in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you all for your interest, for your participation, and for your inputs. Over to you, Noah.
Thank you, Sobi. So for those of you just joining, this panel is dedicated to the futures of education and UNESCO's work on this in particular. And so we have 4 members of the International Commission. Each of them is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up discussion. And you can participate by putting comments and questions in the chat box. First, I'd like to introduce Arjun Appadurai. Professor Appadurai is well known for his work on globalization, cultural diversity, and the research imagination. He's a professor at NYU and the Hertie School in Berlin. Arjun, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's very good to see the 2 of you from UNESCO, Annette, who's not visible, but I know is there, and my 3 other distinguished colleagues, all of whom I look forward to hearing. It's a challenge to speak at this time about almost anything, but also about education, since we're all dealing with a challenge for which we are not very well equipped. I will today speak through the lens of the current crisis, but I hope to raise issues which are not confined to this time, in the hope that this time will pass, though we will learn a lot from it, I have no doubt. And I hope the lessons we learn from it will apply to our longer term concerns. But like the rest of you, it's difficult to speak entirely outside of this moment. So let me begin, and I must say, I've rethought what I might have said in the light of recent remarks. So what I say today will be very spontaneous. It's not fully formed, but I have some points and I will go through them. And I want to make sure I'm with the clock. And please, I hope either Sobi or Noah will let me know when I may be a minute away from my time. I have a watch too, but I tend to forget to look at it. The first thing is the one sentence I sent that I think is a challenge for our commission and for the constituencies to whom we plan to speak, and that is the necessity that this crisis brings to us, and all crises do, for producing reliable knowledge very fast, that is urgently, speedily, quickly. And my reflection is, though we are increasingly faced with that type of demand, and the coronavirus crisis is the most recent and possibly the biggest of these, all crisis-driven appeals to knowledge production, learning, teaching, run against the natural rhythm of most educational processes, whether they are for very young children or for mature young adults, or indeed for adults of any age, people doing continuing education at all these levels. The general rhythm of teaching and learning is gradual, you might say. It is slow. And it is slow and cumulative in 2 ways. One, in a human life cycle. Nobody learns everything they need to know in 1 day or 1 hour or 1 week. We keep learning and we keep unlearning. That is what becoming a responsible adult is about, is learning ideally all your life and unlearning things that really are shown to be, sorry. Pardon me, I'm a 6-year-old and I forgot to shut my door completely.
No problem.
Going a little berserk after 10 days indoors, but anyway, so there's this tension between the slowness of learning in the human life cycle, but also historically. We all know that knowledge does not accumulate, rapidly. There are topics on which human beings have been trying to understand things and teach things and learn things for millennia. And in some cases, our progress is depressingly slow. In other cases, it's faster, but it's never overnight. So I put that forward as a dilemma, that when we are in crises such as the present one, or in previous one, like the financial crises or other health crises, political crises, major wars, etc., there is a tendency for education to seem, and I speak now about education in the broadest sense, to seem somehow irrelevant or unimportant. And so the question then is how we continue to value teaching, learning, education, and the relative slowness of that set of processes, even while recognizing that we have some urgency, indeed emergency going on. So that's my first point. My second point is, I was in a Zoom-based class with some students of mine in New York yesterday, discussing a book, a very specific book about terrorism in the early period after 2001, after the attacks on the Twin Towers. So it was a book about Al-Qaeda. It was not about ISIS. It's not today's headlines, but it was a very big crisis at the time. And one of the points there that the author of the book reminded us was, in some sense, it was when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima, in an urgent sense, it was the first time, and Hannah Arendt was the one who really had this insight, that everyone realized, because all of humanity could be destroyed, that indeed there was such a thing as humanity. So the paradox is that it is in the moment of the potential destruction of all of mankind that the idea of humanity, which of course has a long history, really became real. And so with COVID, again, we are discussing this. We are discussing all of a sudden the realization, so we said 130 countries, I didn't know the number, but that's pretty close to a large chunk of mankind that's either in the crisis or right near it. No one's out of it that is in any way informed. So we are rediscovering yet again our humanity, but the difference is this time that we are discovering our humanity at a time we're also aware of non-human forces and beings in the world, plants, animals. In other words, we have a new idea of the planet. We're not so narrowly human anymore, but we certainly are recognizing our common humanity. And there are still voices reminding us that the relation of humans to animals, to viruses, and so on is very complex, and we can't hive humanity off from the rest of the planet. So this is my second point, that we, in a way, there is a message here, again, for us, that we are a species that has a great deal in common. And one thing we have in common is the capacity or the potential to disappear together. Now, hopefully that's not the only thing we can learn about humanity. So I would say for education, maybe one lesson we can keep in mind that is our common humanity, which is very hard to do in a situation where nation states have their interests, various groups have their interests, ethnicities have their interests, religion has their interests. So common humanity is not a simple thing to bear in mind, but we need to do that. So that's my second point. My third point is familiar to all of us. I just remind us that this type of crisis, this crisis and this type of crisis is another reminder of the difference and relationship between knowledge and information. So for me, knowledge is something we gain so that we can process information. Knowledge is not the same as information. And of course, we deal in a world of of a lot of suspicion about all kinds of information, fake news, for example, but any other stuff from social media. We are swamped with information, much of which we are in no position to assess. So I would say one of the single biggest goals I can imagine for education at all levels, both in the past, but especially now, is to build the capacity among people to develop, and I mean children, young adults, all of us, through our institutions, to build knowledge capacities which allow us to handle the overflow of information of numerous types. How do we tell if somebody is doing a scientifically good analysis of COVID? How do we tell if a neighbor is well informed? This is the world in which knowledge, information, news, rumor, fakes, all are crowding each other. And I think we need to tackle that problem. So knowledge versus information, an old distinction, but I think once again, in front of us as we flounder through an excess of knowledge. So you read, for example, this world chronometer of COVID that I'm sure all of you have looked at country by country, very detailed, extremely impressive, but also very neutral. So it doesn't easily tell you what to make of all of it. Just a terrific amount of data, but not lots of tools to interpret, analyze, and debate. Where will that come from? What kind of education? By whom, to whom? Sobi has already mentioned that all of us who are homebound, especially those who have either children or grandchildren somewhere or relating to students, know that the question of the platform is now crucial. Where's the line between the household and the school and the college? That's a key issue. I won't say more because Sobi's already mentioned it. I'm sure all of you have thoughts on it. Last point, which I think is the most important one, and then I will stop, is that a couple of Chinese friends and colleagues have raised the point in the face of the kind of racist effort to brand China and Chinese, not just China, but Chinese, not just the party, but the people, as the villains of this piece. Well, a student of mine, again in my class yesterday, who is Chinese, said very movingly and thoughtfully, he said, you know, all of humanity, that apparently some Russian philosopher has given a statement. I don't know who, he didn't name him, so I can't cite it precisely. But the idea is straightforward. That is, we ourselves are viral now because of the globality of our age. We move across borders. We are in touch. The other traditional way of putting it is we are highly super connected, and there's no way to turn that back. So on the one hand, we live in a world of super connectivity. In fact, you might say saturation by connectivity of every type: digital, physical, technical, etc. That is a given. Everybody's somehow in touch with everybody else, one way or the other. Our response structures are entirely, however, from the platform of the nation state. So every one of us is talking about closing borders. Germany is being admired. I admire Germany. I'm in Germany right now. But how long can the closing borders approach work? So I conclude by saying the biggest tension that I think educational institutions, thinkers, and leaders have to face is, in a world of connectivity, how can we work? Can we simply have a national lens for handling major problems? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Arjun. If you've just joined the conversation, you've joined a discussion about the futures of education with 4 members of UNESCO's International Commission. Our next speaker just left the video. If you're going to come back, Antonio, otherwise we'll go on. Let's go to Fernando next and get Antonio later. Fernando Reimers teaches at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Fernando, over to you.
Thank you very much, Noah. Let me just share my screen here so that I can have some slides. Let me see if I can do this. There we go. And then let me go over here. All right. Am I sharing my screen? Do you see it?
Yes.
All right. So let me first say how much I appreciate that we have 330 participants taking part in this conversation today amidst the most serious pandemic, which makes evident this pandemic, the need for good government, for collaboration and for international collaboration. And the enormity of the loss of life and human suffering, which is going to be caused by this pandemic, cannot be overstated. So this is tough for all of us. But I'm hoping that there will be some silver linings from this global tragedy. Now, this pandemic, for one, is creating a shared experience for humanity, which is being felt directly by more humans, a greater percentage of humans than any other previous war or catastrophe, where the pain was experienced vicariously, indirectly. And so perhaps when this long night is over and we see the dawn again, we will have a different appreciation of the idea that Terence put forth 20 centuries ago when he said that to be human is to live, so that nothing human is foreign to us. And certainly, this is certainly the case with respect to biology. A virus knows very few boundaries. Now, I read your participation on this panel as an expression of that hope, that after the long night that we are going to be in, and this will be long, there is going to be a dawn, and that the most responsible thing we can do is to try to keep a sense of normalcy and to plan for the future, which is exactly what this commission is about. So I want to talk about three ideas. One, why is it important to examine education goals and to provide guidance for curriculum? I want to talk about the role of these and previous commissions of UNESCO on education. And then I want to suggest that one of the things that this commission might do, that this report might do, is to influence educational change, understood multidimensionally, and I want to talk about what that means. Ever since UNESCO was established, it has been in the business of expanding the collective imagination about what it is that we should do with education. Going back to the right of education, look at Article 26.2. It presents not only a very hopeful, but a very capacious idea of what it is that education should be about. And that is a mission that UNESCO, more than any other international organization, has been steadfast on for over 7 decades. 1974, when UNESCO published the Declaration for International Understanding and Cooperation, I had a chance to revisit it recently. Very powerful idea. The two reports that Sobi referred to put forth very powerful ideas that actually influence the collective mindset of what it meant to educate. Before learning to be, most governments thought of education as access. And after learning to be, published in 1972, we began to understand the importance of preparing people for lifelong learning. The Delors report, the notion of learning to live together, and the idea that we had to focus beyond cognition into social skills and self-knowledge actually took hold in how governments thought about education. And then, of course, more recently, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a phenomenal provocation, a very good provocation, a challenge to all of us. I mean, so much of a challenge that so many are in a conversation about whether these can be achieved or not. But that's not important. What is important is that we have governments changing the goals of education in response to these provocations. And I hope that this commission will build on that tradition and will have similar outcomes. So I have been studying for the last decade how it is that governments frame the goals of education in a range of countries. And there is no question that all these international frameworks, conversations, dialogues influence how governments frame the goals of education, and they have placed curriculum again at the forefront of the policy agenda. Of course, curriculum is not self-executing. So the question is, how do we think about transforming education systems so they actually have the capacity to act on these ambitious curriculums? In a forthcoming book, not this one, I look at how some of the countries that, some of the poorest countries in the world have changed their curriculum. And this phenomenon is pretty much present everywhere that I have examined. Countries from the poorest ones to the wealthier ones are trying to get their public schools to teach more, to teach a broader set of skills to their students. Now, I think it's very important then to put in the conversation and in the work of our commission how it is that we think education systems are going to change, because what the experience of the 7 decades show is that educational change cannot be simply wished to happen. That change doesn't happen because one of these commissions of UNESCO puts out a reform, doesn't even happen because the government changes the curriculum. And what I argue in this new book, in which I present the theory of educational change, is that educational change is simultaneously a cultural, a psychological, a professional, an institutional, and a political process. And that we are more capable of not just understanding, but supporting change if we can think of it simultaneously through each of these perspectives, because each one of them enhances the others, provides light to the others. And I think the role of this commission is especially to influence the set of shared expectations, the cultural expectations about what it is that education can and should do. Now, in my view, what I think is novel about this commission relative to the 2 previous ones is that we have opportunities for co-construction that were simply unavailable. I mean, just look at this conversation, 333 people from 50 different countries participating in a conversation. I believe that Sobi is going to share with us later 3 different avenues through which each one of you and the constituencies that you can reach out to can shape the work of this commission. And I believe that our product is going to be not a set of commandments of what it is the government should do, but a resource that we hope various stakeholders, local communities at many different levels can co-create with this commission in translating this new set of cultural expectations, these new hopes for education into actual strategies that can be executed in those particular settings. Now, once this night is over, I imagine, of course, we're all going to be thinking a lot about pandemics, as we should. But we should also be thinking about climate change, which is in many ways similar to a pandemic. It does require collective action. It does require good government. It requires government acting on evidence. There is a stubbornness of the facts that defies even the most poetic presidents in their wishes to create a virtual reality. I mean, at the end, a virus or climate change doesn't care what we want reality to be. And I'm hoping that attention to climate change, where the clock is ticking as much as it is clicking for this COVID-19, is going to be front and center to the work of this commission and to the collective action that it inspires. Another one is violence, is the reality of violence of various sorts around the world, both in the form of open war, but various different forms of structural violence and social violence experienced by particular groups within society, perpetrated by other groups, will also be an important theme of this report. And certainly the idea of being more intentional in cultivating the capacities for every person to understand that to be human is to live so that nothing human is foreign to us. The idea of global citizenship, which has been so central to UNESCO for 75 years, I hope will be a very central idea of this work. And perhaps the silver lining of this pandemic is that we will all be more ready to embrace it. So I thank you all for participating in this meeting, and especially for your partnership in making the work of this commission a jointly owned process with the communities that you participate in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Really appreciate those comments. Again, if you're just joining, this panel is dedicated to a conversation on the futures of education, and we have 4 speakers who are members of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, put together by UNESCO. held its first meeting in January. So now I'd like to pass the floor over to Antonio Novoa. Professor Novoa is former rector of the University of Lisbon, and is now serving as the Portuguese ambassador to UNESCO. Antonio.
Everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you talking about the futures of education. At a time when the future seems to be shortened by the emergence of this new pandemic situation. When UNESCO launched this project, none of us imagined that the theme was going to have such an immediate and urgent relevance. The tsunami that we are experiencing will have unprecedented consequences in the field of education. It's necessary to prepare ourselves with intelligence, with the strengths of cooperation, with the open sharing of knowledge. In his novel, Ignorance, Milan Kundera wrote, and I'm quoting, "Everyone is wrong about the future. We can only be certain about the present. But the person with no knowledge of the future cannot understand the meaning of the present." This is the reason for the Futures of Education initiative, trying to look to the future to understand the present and all that we have to do to overcome inequalities in education, inequalities that deepen other inequalities that make the world more fragile. The Futures of Education initiative is not, I'm underlining this, is not a futuristic exercise like so many others that in recent years have been extraordinarily popular. Futurism, in fact, has three major venerations: the digital, the artificial intelligence, and the brain. None of us in this panel or in the Commission disregards the importance of these three topics, but we must look at them with caution as a starting point and not, as so often happens, as a solution, or even worse, as the solution. These three futurisms are linked by a common denominator. They all announce the disintegration of the school, establishing a more individualized, a more private relationship with education. The digital, of course, announces the possibility of an education made from home or other private locations. The artificial intelligence, and I'm quoting a well-known French author, announces a transhumanistic school where it will be normal to modify the brains of students using the whole panoply of the NBIC technologies. For its part, neuroscience proposes, first, to personalize learning, and then to optimize bioelectronically the brain. In one way or another, and this is my point, all these futurisms aim at the confinement of education within private spheres. As a consequence, says our colleague David Labery, as a consequence, education tends to be re-established through a consumerist approach that undermines the role of schooling, a consumerist approach that constitutes, in my opinion, the greatest danger for the future of schooling. The current situation, and we have all talked about this, the current situation with the coronavirus does nothing more than accentuate this trend and this danger. This must be a matter of great concern to us all. That's why I would like, in this second part of my intervention, to remember a text by Edgar Morin, the French philosopher, about the herd system. And I'm adapting this text to the education system, quoting Edgar Morin. When a system is unable to deal with its vital problems, it degrades, disintegrates, or else it is capable of creating a process of metamorphosis. The probable is disintegration. The improbable but possible is the metamorphosis. For me, the future relies on this possibility of the metamorphosis of the school. We need, of course, a deep change in the organization of the school and in curriculum, in the organization of the school space, in the organization of the school time, in our conception of curriculum, of pedagogy, of learning. Metamorphosis is our way out, not disintegration. And contrary to what happened throughout the 20th century, there will not be a single model of school. Therefore, it is worth talking about futures, diverse, plural, based on experience and projects that fortunately already exist all over the world. It is in the strength of this experience, in their capacity for sharing the knowledge they acquire, in their capacity for mutual inspiration, that the future of education will be. And for this, we can never forget that education needs to be a factor to fight inequalities and not to create even more inequalities. Instead of following the path of consumerism in the way that David Labaree wrote about it, instead of following the path of consumerism, we should remember Maxine Green's wise words in her presidential address at the AERA conference in 1982, 40 years ago. And I'm quoting, "I cannot imagine a coherent sense of purpose in education if something common does not arise in a public space." If something common does not arise in a public space. The phrase, in my opinion, is brilliant and calls attention to the concepts of common and of public space. Perhaps we could have, as in the report by the UNESCO of 2015, perhaps we could have a global common good. What I'm trying to say, to conclude this first intervention, is that the future that interests me involves strengthening education as a global common good, and both Arjun Appadurai and Fernando Reimers talk about this. A global common good that arises in a public space. This common does not mean uniformity, on the contrary, but it refers mainly to what enables diverse human beings to act in common and to be recognized for what they are and for what they do. The white role, that's why the white role of education in private spheres is not a solution. The two words that I'm concerned about are diversity and cooperation. The diversity of the futures, the cooperation that allow us to act in common. Schools, of course, must experiment with new ways of organizing space and time, with new ways of organizing the work of teachers and students. The curriculum, as Fernando Reimers told us, must be centered on a planetary consciousness, a curriculum of the world's intelligence, to quote again Edgar Morin, of the intelligence of the world, of the capacity of interlinking everything in the world. We are all part of the same humanity. Arjun Appadurai told it very clearly. And only a global citizenship, a global responsibility for education will allow us to find the paths of the futures in the plural, in diversity, in cooperation, strengthening education as a global common good. That's what I would like to share with you in this moment, a difficult moment of our lives, but where we must have a clear vision of what we want and in what direction we want to work together in UNESCO and in the co-construction of this report with everyone in the world, because that's the most important thing of this report. It's not a report written by an international commission, it's a report that needs to be built, constructed and written for large people in the world, and needs to be a kind of a co-construction, as Fernando has told us, throughout the next 2 years. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share these ideas with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Antonio, for all those wonderful ideas, particularly for introducing the idea of metamorphosis from Edgar Morin. As you've seen, we have a chat going. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to make, please type them in the chat, and we'll go over to the chat in just a bit. Our last speaker is Karen Mundy, also a member of the International Commission on the Futures of Education. Karen, just want to make sure you're video able. Perfect. Professor Mundy is former Chief Technical Officer at the Global Partnership for Education. She's professor at OISE, University of Toronto, and important to also add, a former president of CIES. Over to you, Karen.
I feel really honored to be part of this panel, and especially to have had the opportunity to listen to the very erudite offerings from Professor Appadurai, Antonio, Fernando, and of course, Sobi. I really wanted to come last. I asked to come last. So for those of you who are thinking about gender dynamics, do not feel that in any way I've been left off the roster till the end, but in fact, without purpose. And I think in a way, just wanted also to make sure that people had a sense of what the commission itself looks like in terms of diversity, because that might not be entirely obvious from this specific panel. And I want to not focus what I'm going to say entirely on COVID, although we cannot help but be drawn to COVID in thinking today. I know many of you are students. You will have woken up today to a kind of ongoing uncertainty that you've never faced in your lifetime, nor have I. And I want to make sure that just beginning that we talk a little bit about CIES as a community. So let me just begin by saying a bit about the future of education, the commission itself, and what it looks like, and what the kinds of conversations that commission has begun to have. So first of all, it's a commission that represents all parts of the globe and isn't only formed of academics, but has a good number of people both from the business sector, from the high-tech sector, as well as from the university sector. Two of the most vocal participants on that panel are, of course, the president of the panel, who is the president of Ethiopia, and Minister Sergei Thiam, coming from Senegal. Two of the largest populations, representing two of the largest African high population countries. There is a representation from indigenous communities. And across the age span, I think our youngest member may be somewhere around 40, and I don't want to say who the oldest is. But I'm aging up into into that category. One thing that I noticed in the conversations that we had at the Futures Commission is that we had a great deal of problem thinking about the future. Why? Because the temporal realities are very difficult to grasp depending on who you are and where you sit. So let me give you an example. We had a large debate with those of us sitting who had worked in international organizations, helping countries, including in Africa, wanting to argue for the need for basic education, the need to focus on those left behind. Whereas we heard from some of our African colleagues about the need to invest in knowledge, in science, in building human institutions to generate knowledge. There was a great deal, we did a great future exercise where we broke into groups and tried to think about what 2050 could look like and what actions would need to be taken to prevent it. I was impressed at how easily all teams, all groups came with a sense of the future crisis, but perhaps less impressed with our ability to stage and prioritize a pathway out of climate crisis, out of the crisis of human knowledge versus the machine, out of the crisis of privacy, out of, in fact, the crisis of individualism. Many of you will have read some of my previous work on global governance and educational change. I started writing about this in the late 1990s, and my first article, the title is framed around the notion of world disorder. Certainly this COVID crisis shows us in highlighted form the degree to which we live in a world of disorder. So some of the consensus, we call it the post-World War II consensus about how to organize human society, has shifted fundamentally, but not in ways that Professor Appadurai perhaps described in 1998 or 2000. It's changed again. So we're seeing both the pull towards virality. That's a great phrase. I really appreciated that imagery, that the individual has become viral and individualism has become viral, absolutely. At the same time, we see large, successful governments who are not operating around a notion of the individual as the fundamental building block of human society. So really we are working in a world in which there are very different images of how we build up human society for collective good. And of course, we've seen starkly that in Asian societies, the ability to handle crises is very high, whereas in Western societies, it's very low. I believe this is going to imprint upon our futures in perhaps undetermined, but very fundamental ways. After all, we can speak very loftily about the imagined community, about the moral purpose of education. But we need to understand that that moral purpose is framed very differently in these two cultural orders. And that one of our fundamental tasks is going to be to have a dialogue, as my mentor and lifelong friend Ruth Hayhoe says, a dialogue across these civilizational and collective orders. And of course, I'm speaking specifically about Asia and particularly China. I've been very impressed with the degree to which students in my class on global governance engage with Yuval Harari's work about the future and the three crises of the future: the climate crisis, the crisis of privacy, and then the crisis of collective action. It seems to me that we are about to face, at the end of this crisis, one of the largest economic recessions that we have ever faced. And so we need to think not only about the future because of the crisis, but the future after the economic crisis that we're about to go through. We know from the past that education suffers in two ways. When there is a health crisis, education is the tail of the dog. It gets wagged around, but there is very little foresight in planning for education's future, planning for learning continuity. Yesterday, I launched a letter, an open letter to a Minister of Education, and I really invite everyone to take a look at it, really asking education ministers to step up and to preserve the space for education, protect their own workforce, and so on. Noah, you had your finger up. Did you? Time?
1 more minute, my apologies.
Okay, oh, that's my 1 minute running. But also just to note, as we were speaking, I read a series of tweets from, highlighting that David Malpass at the World Bank has already started to talk about the need for structural adjustment following this COVID crisis. So we need to keep our eyes on this future of governance, not only, very importantly, this notion of moral reasoning and the purpose of education in creating collective action based on new forms of moral reasoning, but also really examining where the money will flow following this crisis, how we will achieve not just recognition, to use Nancy Fraser's term, very important, that recognition in a post-individualistic world order, but also how will we achieve redistribution? And education has always played such a fundamental role in that redistributive aim, perhaps a greater role than it ought to. It was striking to see how many schools around the world offer major services like school feeding, laundry services in New York City. A couple 100,000 children who go to school use the laundry facilities at schools and now have no access to such sanitation. That in the richest country in the world. So I think we're going to have to really think through and watch, be vigilant as we see what this post-crisis means, and thinking about that future as what are the building blocks in our human society? How does our Western reasoning or imagination of our imaginary community not really match to the reasoning or the imaginations of those in other parts of the world? And then very obviously, helping all of us to think about the future in ways that are both fast and slow. I'm referring to Daniel Kahneman's notion of thinking fast and slow. We need to think fast. Arjun really described that well. We also need to think slow, and we need to be able to apply moral reasoning and build up the building blocks of consensus in a very, very polarized and a very difficult world order. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Karen. I appreciate it. There's a lot of great questions in the chat that have come up. We'll go to them in 1 second, but quickly, Arjun, Fernando, Antonio, Karen as well. Do you want to make any comments on points that have come up so far? Okay.
No, let's go to the questions.
Okay, Annette, can you just pick maybe 2 questions to start off with, please?
Yes, sure. So one of the questions that came up in the chat box, what are the next steps for schools, districts, states, and nations in order to address inequities that result from the current consumerism and disintegration? Did you know that, Noah? And another one, what are the trending interests in community involvement in school design and planning?
Okay. Anyone on the panel want to respond to either of those?
I want to speak to a question, if I may, that I have read on the thread. On someone perceived that in our remarks, the work of this commission is very addressed to national levels of government. And I want to clarify that perception, because I know that in our conversations at our last meeting, I think we have a tacit consensus that this commission doesn't see itself speaking only to national governments, but that we fully understand the multi-layer nature of governance, but also the very important role of civil society in education. So when I said that we see our report as an input that will be co-constructed, I did not imply that will be co-constructed only by national ministries of education. I believe that one of the lessons that this response to this pandemic will make evident is the need for agency and for partnership of multiple stakeholders in protecting the health and ensuring the continuous education of the children. And the role for governments and various groups is to address the most vulnerable. I mean, we already see in the response to this crisis that it's a lot easier for some children to retain a sense of normalcy and to have their educational opportunities preserved because they have access to devices and connectivity, whereas others do not. And they have to depend on learning packets if and their schools are able to provide learning packets on paper or other means. So in response to that question, I believe this may be one issue that in which this commission is very different from the previous two, which I do think were speaking more directly to national governments, as was at the time, the way in which I believe UNESCO constructed its role.
Go for it, Arjun.
Yeah, thank you. Several of the questions I've seen from people who are following us and are part of this session, but who are not on the panel, refer to technology, and I think it came up in almost all our comments in one way or the other. So I just want to share a thought about technology, namely digital technology, the technology of our times, the technology that defines our times, and to underscore the point made by, or the points made by Antonio, and I think also by Karen, indirectly by Fernando as well, that we are in a moment where technology potentially has become our savior, as in Zoom today, and as in the classes that are going on in all our Western universities, which suddenly have gone online. Our entire university administrations have become now, as it were, digital entities who are telling us how to do this and that online, how to be in touch. So all good, but there is a worry there, which is that we will be further pushed into a world which is not only consumerist and heavily dependent on, let's say, privatizing platforms and techniques, but that we will deepen, to me, the most crucial thing about our current crisis, which is that the ratio of alarm and panic, justified in some way, but excessive in my view, is because it is now us. It's the cosmopolitan middle classes of major Western cities. Almost every other crisis could be put off somewhere. Somebody else was suffering. Ebola, somebody told me today that this past 6 months, 300,000 people have died of measles in Congo. I didn't know that till yesterday. I know it now. Who's written about it? Who knew about it? So I stress that we need to be very careful that we don't create another bubble composed of digitality, individuality, connectivity of the digital type, which then leaves millions, hundreds of millions out. And I think Fernando, from the beginning in all our conversations, has stressed that this cannot be a commission about the people who are on the lifeboat. It has to be the ocean of humanity has to somehow come in. And we are at a moment where we might succumb to a whole set of ways of doing things which are no good for most people in the world. So I think we need to watch the tech question closely. Thank you.
Karen.
I'm going to just jump in and answer the sort of rather practical question about what do we know about education planning in the context of thinking forward to the future, and indeed about crises like this COVID crisis. While I was at GPE, we spent quite a bit of time supporting countries to retool their education sector plans to focus, at least in part, on crisis and resiliency. Of course, in that framing, we were working with many other partners, UNESCO, International Network for Education in Emergencies. I mean, many, I'm leaving many out, but really trying to get governments to understand that this problem or challenge of resiliency was likely to be part of their educational futures. I'm not sure we did a very good job of it when it comes to a crisis like the COVID crisis. Why do I say that? In part because most of the crises that we were imagining were crises where collective action, i.e. face-to-face collective groupings, would still be possible. So the idea was start to cluster kids together and build back your system as a set of clusters. Arjun, I think you're very right that this is a very different scenario. It's actually a crisis that pushes us socially apart. And for those of us who have digital connectivity, we can collectively act, but we can't do the sort of normal thing that we would do during a war, during and of course, we're leaving behind large numbers of children. So just to highlight, next week when I published this blog on this sort of series of open letters to the minister looking at learning continuity, I think one of the things I will highlight is that some of the old technologies turn out to be the technologies that are better suited to those living at the bottom of our pyramid, but not only to them, they are also suited to those who care a lot about the relational dynamics of schooling. So for example, radio-based schooling is actually fairly successful. It is especially successful if you match online radio modules with learning material packets sent to the home and with plans to encourage older children to teach younger children. So peer-to-peer opportunities within the household or the community, of course, keeping in mind all of the restrictions that we're going to have on social, because of social distancing. So I think that there are opportunities here to really think about resiliency in the system, to think about not only high-tech but low-tech interventions, and that it isn't only about digital connectivity. There are low-tech solutions that are quite possible. The other thing just to mention is that if we're thinking about learning continuity, if we're thinking about what should a minister do a year from now, it's very clear that there will be a loss of learning, and that the poor child, the child from an environment with less literate materials, less literate parents, is going to fall farther behind than a child in a household with lots of books and parents sitting at home tutoring them. Or even worse, parents purchasing online tutorial services, which I think will very much characterize even the poorest countries of the world. You'll see that the middle classes are going to quickly purchase substitute services. And already you can see the numbers of these services coming out and trying to grab the middle class's attention. We're going to have to think about a form of restarting schools that looks very different than just going back to the classroom. So I'm thinking about ramped up summer schools to bring kids who come from less privileged backgrounds back into the educational mainstream to make sure that they do not suffer. I'm thinking about examinations systems that do not require children from less advantaged households to achieve the same scale of performance in those exams, to ensure that they are moved into the next level of the system. We know that we call it remediation, but it's really not remediation. It's basically making sure that we make up, that we redistribute resources to provide those catch-up services for kids from the poorest household. And I think we know a lot about those now, including from work of the Teaching at the Right Level folks and so on, to get that all jazzed up. Perhaps we know less scientifically about the value of peer-to-peer voluntary work within the realm of these sort of catch-up efforts. That's one thing that we need to explore.
Great, thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. If I may, there's a couple of questions have brought up issues of citizenship, global citizenship, and people have also commented on the need, one frequently hears comments on the need for global solidarity at this particular moment. How do we achieve that? Let's take that question over to our panelists. Arjun, no.
I apologize. I'm typing because I have to say my goodbyes for reasons that I won't waste your time on. So,
okay.
Sorry. Thank you all. Bye.
Okay. Antonio, then.
try to comment on that. In fact, for me, it's a kind of a trying, as I try to underline in my talk, is a try to oppose a kind of a consumerist approach, where everyone takes care of the education of their children. And I believe that this crisis is going to accentuate a lot this trend, as Karen was explaining. Middle classes, they have all kind of opportunities of looking for other kind of services, other kind of opportunities for their children, or to ask for education as being a global responsibility. And for me, it's very strange being at UNESCO that before this crisis, we can read numbers and statistics like 250 million of children are out of the school in the world. And we can read these kind of numbers as if were only one statistic more. It's not possible. The international community needs to take care of these kind of things, cannot read these numbers, cannot say in a kind of, I would say, almost cynical way that the progress toward the Agenda 2030 will not achieve the goals. We are not doing progress in education in the last years. It's not possible. And so the only explanation is that we have not yet arrived at the point of making education a global responsibility. And this is related with multilateralism, with the role of multilateralism. Of course, that multilateralism relies on national governments, but it needs to go beyond national governments. You need to have a kind of a responsibility, which I call global citizenship. It's a word that sometimes is too rhetorical, I agree, but many people, I remember, for instance, Carlos Alberto Torres, who has a share, a UNESCO share on global citizenship, the work that they are doing clearly points on directions that I think we should follow in the next years. We are all very worried about this crisis, of course, but in a sense, and please listen to it in the ideas that I want to share with you. I'm more worried with the post-crisis situation, as Karen was talking. I'm more worried about the world in 1 year, because I'm almost absolutely sure that we'll be able to go ahead of this crisis. I'm very confident in science. I'm very confident in open science. I think that the idea of open science is now more than ever absolutely crucial for us. And the idea of the sharing knowledge, putting people working together with data, with results, with science. I'm almost sure that in 1 year, in a couple of months, we'll be able to go ahead of this crisis. But the problem is the consequences of this crisis, economical, social, in the more fragile situations, the more fragile regions of the world, in the people that it was already very badly educated, of course in Africa, of course in Asia, but also in our countries, because we have the same problem in many regions of our countries. And I think that calling for a global citizenship, for me, it's calling for this kind of global responsibility and not putting education in a kind of a private idea. Each one of us will provide the best education for our children. That's obvious, of course, but it's not enough to build an educational action. It's not enough in terms to build a future for education. And I think that we cannot lose the main ideas that were behind public education, that were behind the idea of compulsory schooling, of school for all. And I think that more than ever, we need to enter in the post-crisis situation with these ideas very clear in our mind, and with the strong responsibility of multilateral organizations like UNESCO.
Thanks, Antonio. Fernando?
Yeah, I just wanted to conclude on this note. There is a an old proverb in Spanish, which is amanece que no es poco, which says there is a dawn every day, which is no small thing. And I think it's important that we remember that every day, for the forthcoming days, but especially when this pandemic is over, we should be grateful that there is a dawn, just as we should be grateful to our schools. It is very easy from a position of great privilege to undermine this remarkable construction of humanity over the last 7.5 decades in building a basic infrastructure of schooling that includes just about every child in the world. We didn't have these 7.5 decades ago. And I'm hoping that one of the things this crisis is doing is helping all of us appreciate all of our teachers a lot more than we normally do. Not only for the work that they did before the pandemic, but for the work that many of them are continuing to do under extraordinary circumstances. I know that in Spain every morning, in France, neighbors are going out to their windows and applauding their healthcare workers who are risking their lives. And so they're recognizing them for their important role. But we should also be applauding our teachers who are trying to sustain a sense of normalcy and education for our kids under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And I'm hoping that one of the silver linings of this pandemic, when it is over, is that it'll make it a lot clearer to everybody how crucial, how important, that valuable that work is. So I would just like to conclude thanking Sobi and Noah and my colleagues for having organized that, thanking the 300 participants who have joined us today, thanking CIES for having so quickly converted this into a virtual discussion. And I'd just like to conclude appreciating the fact that there is a dawn every day. Amanece que no es poco.
Thank you very much, Fernando. I'm just going to pass to Annette because she's reminding me there's a couple questions that we need to make sure are answered. There's lots really rich ideas here, but Annette?
So there are lots of questions out there. Maybe we can choose a more procedural one in terms of referring to the work of the International Commission. So how are you engaging youth and youth perspectives in the Commission's work?
Okay. Sobi, do you want to come in on that maybe? And also feel free to offer any other observations.
Right. Thanks. If I can respond to that, but I'd also like to make a few comments from the conversation just now. Noah, is this time to do it? All right. I mean, one is COVID-19 is just recalling that we have shared global challenges and threats. This is not the first, but this is the focus of everyone's attention now, and for good reason, because it's putting people's lives and health at risk. But I mean, global challenges, we have global challenges around inequalities, widening inequalities. It's not everybody's focus. This is not new, but it is still there. Several years ago, it became a focus on security, terrorism, violence. That has not gone away. It's still there. Then we moved to technology, big data, artificial intelligence, surveillance, privacy issues. That's still there and developing, but we're not focused on that. And then climate change was our recent focus internationally or globally, until now a health crisis. So these shared challenges, threats, crises are, and I think we've heard that from all, is about a collective responsibility and the need for collective response, collective action, solidarity, international cooperation being as important as ever, and rediscovering our shared humanity, as Arjun Appadurai put it, and to strengthen citizenship in this global, interconnected, interdependent, and viral world. And there's still in the backdrop this tension between this collective responsibility, this global citizenship to respond to global and shared threats with a structure that is still inherited from the nation state. On the future of education at a time of crisis, we heard well from Antonio that it's the work of the Commission is not a futuristic exercise. It's about looking at the future, into the future, the probable futures and the desirable futures as a starting point for dealing with the present and for dealing with the present differently. And that there are diverse plural futures and a possibility for transformation or metamorphosis and not disintegration. We also recall the issue of temporality. I mean, how to look at the future when we are in a mode of emergency and crisis right now. And just to get back to COVID-19 and impact on education. And as I said, we have been talking to and hearing ministers and other education officials over the last 10 days. There is the immediate impact of immediate impact on education, just in terms of health and information and awareness and safety. There is immediate impact in terms of kind of disintegrating the organized learning community around formal education. So it's maintaining communication and social contact with families, with learners, with teachers. It's obviously disrupting studies and the learning process, and there are responses to that in terms of combinations of technologies, some online and some combining TV and radio and other things. And then there's an impact in terms of how we look at one step ahead in terms of planning and management. There's one of the more immediate ones is examinations. What will happen to those? Do they get digitized? Do they get postponed? And but there's also all the return, and I think Karen mentioned that very clearly. You know, how will we deal with re-motivating learners? We know that there's a high risk of dropout and disengagement with any period of closure, of unplanned closure of education. What will be the impact on teachers, on contract teachers, and on the teaching force? And then finally, a longer term perspective, which I think is the work of the Commission, perhaps changing our mindsets and a shift in paradigm. And it's not only about accepting new technologies, but it's also how do we perhaps value once again some of the other learning within our communities, revalue culture, the participation of families in the educational process, redefining kind of what learning communities are about. So last point, just to, in this time of, you know, a common threat, global crisis, collective response and responsibility, and this was said by a number of the panelists, the work of the Commission is about co-creation, and there are different platforms for doing this. We have a number of online platforms. I think that the links were sent, focus group discussions, seminars, the possibility of organizing discussions in your different within your different frameworks and constituencies and your networks. As far as youth are concerned, we have reached out through a number of partners who can leverage some of the youth networks. That is critical to getting their voices. We have planned or had planned, we will see how we do that. We will have to adapt given the current circumstances, but a set of regional youth dialogues, both online and we hope offline, face-to-face. If UNESCO is organizing any one organized regional consultation beyond these other platforms as part of the Futures of Education, we thought it would be essential that we have youth voices up front to contextualize not from their perspective and within their context, representatives of student organizations and youth groups. Back over to you, Noah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sobi. And thank you to everyone on the panel and those of you in the audience. My one complaint is we can't now have 300 people applauding, but let's imagine that sound. Again, thank you for your comments. We'll post the recording.
Can I just interrupt and say a last word, please? Sorry very much.
That's what I was planning. Go for it. Last word, Karen.
That CIES is a society of many, many active individuals. And just a reminder, I'm sure everybody would take this. We are already doing this, but please remember to reach out to your international colleagues. Remember that kindness today is an investment in global governance in the future. Reach out to your international students. They're suffering a lot. And to your international colleagues. Start to build those bridges. The future is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Again, thank you all. And we'll all be in touch and we'll all be working on this together. Appreciate the space, Iveta, and everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference, both this week and April, May, June, and beyond.